Hello everyone and welcome to the Chocolatier's Kitchen podcast series. I'm Annette Smith, Callebaut lead chef, born and raised South African and now discovering Belgium as my new host country. I didn't come to the studio alone today. I'm honored to have two guests joining me. Our first guest is Director of Savor School, flamboyant chocolate and pastry chef from Down Under. Hello, how are you, Kirsten Tibbles?
I'm wonderful, Manette. I'm so excited to be part of this podcast.
It's great to have you here, Kirsten. And our second guest is co-author of The Chocolatier's Kitchen, a very familiar face as former Callebaut chef and now working in pastry business in Australia. Hi, Ryan Stevenson. How are you?
Hi, Manette. I'm fantastic as well. Hi, Kirsten. I'm very happy to be here also.
The Chocolatier's Kitchen. After the book, listen to the podcast series about shelf life in confectionery products.
Today we talk a little bit about shelf life of confectionery products such as bonbons, dragées, chocolate bars, etc. Now let's start off with a paradigm. As chocolatiers, we love to spoil with delicious fresh products, but in the end, we also want to give the products a sufficient time on the shelf and to be sold and not to go to waste. Now, what exactly determines the shelf life of a confectionery product, Ryan?
Well, first and foremost, when we're talking about the shelf life of bonbons, we're actually referring more concretely to the shelf life of the fillings in the bonbon. That's the real critical part to focus on here. When we look into it more specifically, then we're looking at the way the filling behaves over time in its chocolate shell and the speed in which the microbacteria evolve, and that's what's going to determine the eventual shelf life of your product.
Let's also not forget, as a chocolatier, you have an array of products and you're really looking for a range of both shorter shelf life and longer shelf life products. I think shelf life is really one of the most essential aspects of producing chocolates and selling them because it really is the key to limit your wastage and increase the profitability of your business. So understanding it completely is really essential.
And also, Kirsten, from your experience, why is understanding and managing shelf life so important for artisan chocolatiers?
It's something that we don't often consider as our first thought. We think about the fit out of our shop. We want to make beautiful and delicate products that look beautiful and showcase our skill set. But what you need to keep in mind is that shelf life is really key to ensure that you increase your profitability, but it also helps to decrease wastage. So wastage is a real problem in a business. So by controlling your shelf life and doing a range of products, both fresh and longer, it's going to help you to reduce that wastage, increase your profitability. So it really is essential and key when running a business. In fact, one of the most important aspects.
And Ryan, maybe you can tell us, how would you determine what is the ideal shelf life then?
So I always try and give advice to chocolatiers about what the ideal shelf life should be. You should always develop your recipes with the end rotation in mind. So in other words, how fast can you sell it? Is it 2 weeks? Well, then that's great. Then you can aim for a shelf life of 3 to 4 weeks. You have to remember to give your customers at least 1 or 2 weeks once they've bought it to be able to consume it. Now, suppose you're selling to local retailers or exporting your products abroad, then it's a little bit harder to estimate. You need to know and understand the rotation of the product for your customers, understand how long it's going to be for shipping, that type of thing. And also, again, give your customers time to still enjoy the product. So if you're exporting, if you're sending your chocolates to local retailers, then your shelf life for your product, it might even go to 3 months or more.
That's absolutely true. You know, you can be an incredibly creative chocolatier or pastry chef and make magnificent products. But you need to think from a business point of view. So you need to consider selling the product, when the product expiries are, and how they're going to be enjoyed in the best possible way. And there's so many things that you need to consider. So hygiene, you need to look at ingredients that you're going to use, your storage conditions. All these aspects are going to influence how your product will evolve over time. So based on your estimated rotation, you will need to make choices in ingredients. So you can incorporate certain ingredients that will increase the shelf life, and you can also decrease certain ingredients that might have a lot of water in them, for example, which can really impact the finished shelf life of your product.
Now that's really interesting. Okay, before we deep dive into balancing recipes, let's go back to the bonbon fillings. Suppose I made a beautiful ganache. What exactly in my filling will determine its shelf life?
There's lots of things that will determine the shelf life, but one really important aspect is the water activity, and we call that AW value. So we link AW value to certain ingredients. So there's ingredients that you may not even consider have water and varied amounts of water. For example, cream, butter has water, we've got fruit purees. These are all the ingredients that we're incorporating into our ganaches, and it will help to control the shelf life by understanding that water activity of those ingredients once combined with chocolate to create a ganache.
Yeah, I totally agree, Kirsten. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper just so people have got a full understanding of what it's about. So as you said, let's give the example of butter. Butter's got 16% water into it. Now, this water is what we call a free water. So it's just floating around in your ganache. And when we're measuring the water activity, what we're actually measuring is the ratio of the vapor pressure of the food compared to the vapor pressure of distilled water. So what this means is that we're going to use a machine, for example, and we're going to see how much of this free water is escaping into the atmosphere. Now, the AW value is a range from 0 to 1. And a good example is, okay, let's say a food has a value of 0.8. Then that means that the vapor coming off the water is 80% of that of water. Now, why is this even important? So you need to understand that bacteria needs water to live in and to grow. So when we're talking about shelf life, when we're talking about water activity, we're measuring how much free water there is in regards to how much bacteria is possible to grow. Let's say we've got a product and it has a AW value of 0.6. That's fantastic because 0.6 and under products are deemed to be stable as there's not enough free water to support life. The more water we have, though, the more yeasts and bacteria have the opportunity to grow. A ganache, for example, that has a shelf life of 0.85, this is only going to last about 3 weeks before spoilage is going to occur. If you have something between 0.85 and 0.7, then you're looking at a shelf life, again, it's an approximation of around 3 months. And anything from between 0.7 and 0.65, you're looking about 6 to 9 months.
Ryan, that information is so valuable, it's brilliant. What I think we also need to take into consideration is the taste of our product. So the taste of your product is really key for your brand and your name. We know that water evaporates from our product, so the filling can become a little bit drier, but also the flavour can dissipate and change. So I think it's really important to do your own testing to make a batch of products and to taste them over a period to determine when you're no longer happy with the quality and the flavour of that product. And that really should determine your shelf life. Water activity is essential for shelf life, but you also got to take into consideration the taste and the flavour of your product, and that is what is going to represent your brand.
Ryan, are there any specific tools that artisans use to measure the AW value of their fillings?
Yeah, certainly. But I think that the first tool people should be using is learning how to balance your ganaches to avoid that free water. That's the most important one for me. The AW value can be calculated, but it's only going to give you a rough estimate for a product. And to be totally 100% sure of the value, then you have to measure it for each batch that you're producing. This can only be really done by using a water activity measuring machine. There's lots of different brands of machines available, but it's the only way to be 100% sure.
There's something else to consider. You can get an external lab to test your product to determine the shelf life. So they'll give you a full breakdown of what's going on in your chocolate, and they will give you an exact determination of the shelf life of your product. Always consider taste though, so always do your own testing as well.
That really makes sense. It's quite trending amongst artisans to create bonbons with multiple fillings inside. Let's say, for instance, I have a bonbon with more than one filling inside, like a ganache, a gel, a crunchy bit as well. What should I look at then to determine the shelf life of the product?
So you always needed to look at the filling that has the most free water in it. So it's a filling with the highest AW value. Something that happens within these chocolates is a fat migration, but there's also a thing called water migration. So water is going to go from the wettest component to the driest. But obviously your wettest component is the one that's going to go off first.
That's really accurate, Ryan. And it doesn't even matter what volume of a ganache, for example, you put in, and the crunchy element, which may not contain any water. Because you've got that ganache element in, that's really what you need to track to determine your shelf life.
I can imagine that when you start your business, or even when you would be supplying your products to a new customer like a local retail store, it might be hard to understand or to estimate the rotation. Kirsten, what would you say in cases like that? What would you advise?
There are quite a few options, but I think communication is key when you're wholesaling your product. But ultimately, you want to ensure that the customer has the best experience still when they're eating your chocolate. As an option, I would recommend selling products wholesale that have a minimum of 3 months shelf life. So examples of products like that would be marzipan or a firmer ganache that has less water incorporated into it. You could also experiment and learn about products with shorter shelf life, but you would need to communicate with whoever you're selling it to that the expiry date on those products and when they're best to sell. So that would be fresher ganaches that have a slightly shorter shelf life.
I totally agree with you, Kirsten. And on that point, when you are wholesaling, I don't think you have full control after it's been sold. For example, you're going to make the product, you're going to give it to the wholesaler. You're not really 100% certain what happens afterwards. So I think it's always better to go longer to sort of spread your risk, make sure that you're covered. So that you may be saying, okay, 6 to 8 weeks for a bonbon is a good shelf life for this retailer, just to make sure that, of course, you're thinking about the delivery, how long it takes to deliver it, how long it's going to be on the shelves, that's an unknown for you as well, and to make sure that the customer is always getting a perfect product after they've bought it.
And maybe, Kirsten and Ryan, you can also tell me that artisans are mostly interested in offering super tasty products that are different from the mass retail. Could you give examples of products that have artisan spirit and still could benefit from longer shelf life?
When you're an artisan and people are consuming your products, the expectation is that it's, handmade in your small little chocolatier. It's fresh. You can extend shelf life of those products by adding ingredients such as sorbitol. You can incorporate inverted sugar. Alcohols will also help to extend your shelf life, but still have that beautiful fresh flavour and feel that is known in artisan chocolates.
And I think also you can do certain products which industrial or large manufacturers do. You can still make them artisanally. Chocolates or caramel spreads are super easy to make, and they naturally have a long shelf life. Other great products are pralines or bars that are made with the Géant du Jar, and that's just simply mixing chocolate and nut paste together. You can, of course, make your own nut paste. You can differentiate from what large manufacturers are doing by having a homemade praline, mixing that with chocolate, and you've got a long shelf life product already.
Kirsten and Ryan, let's make it concrete. Suppose I would want to stretch the shelf life of a ganache or a filling with about 4 weeks. Where do I start and how do I do it?
There's lots of little steps that you can take to help to increase the shelf life. One of the biggest ones is actually hygiene. So to sanitize your benches, your work surfaces with pure alcohol, to either rub your hands with pure alcohol or always work with gloves. You can look at ultra-pasteurized ingredients, which will help to extend shelf life. And these are really simple steps you can take, which will make a really big difference to the end product and shelf life.
I agree with you. That's really valuable.
I totally agree, Kirsten. I think these are some things that are overlooked. People are quite often focused on the water activity value, but they sort of miss the basics, which is hygiene. And the other thing that I look at, again, it's in the steps of balancing ganaches. It's about changing the sugars. It's kind of the first thing that I try to do. Changing powdered glucose for liquid glucose, for example. Adding sorbitol, which you mentioned earlier. It's a sugar alcohol with great water binding abilities. So the end goal is to reduce the amount of free water in your ganache. Always have a little bit of invert sugar in there to stop the sugars from recrystallizing. And I use dextrose, less sweeter than sugar and good at absorbing water. Having a good base of sugars while keeping the sweetness to the minimum is a great start. Obviously, keeping together with what Kirsten said about the basics, having good hygiene, using pasteurized products, it's always the best way to start.
And apart from the ingredients that you use, what other methodologies do you have to keep in mind to stretch the shelf life?
There are methods we can use in ganaches which will help to extend the shelf life, such as crystallizing your ganache, so pasteurizing your cream and cooling it down, bringing your chocolate to a similar temperature and emulsifying it together does absolutely extend the shelf life of the product, rather than just boiling your liquids and pouring it over the chocolate, but to actually crystallize your ganache will have a dramatic impact on your shelf life.
Yeah, that's very true, Kirsten. There's also other technologies that exist. They're a bit more pricier than just crystallizing your ganache, unfortunately. One of them is vacuum mixing. So this is while you're mixing your ganache, it's going to suck out all the air from your ganache, and while it's doing that, it's actually taking moisture from the ganache. It's a very effective method, but again, it's not for someone who's just starting out on their business. Another good idea is freezing chocolates. Sounds silly, but it works quite well. Lots of large manufacturers will do this. They'll freeze their chocolates and then they'll ship them all over the world. As long as the chocolates are wrapped airtight and they've got a good protective wrapping on them, which isn't opened until they're defrosted, then it's a very easy and cost-efficient method to use.
So thank you, Kirsten and Ryan, for your inputs. You've shared some really interesting points today. So a few important takeouts from the conversation we had today was, firstly, it's important to keep in mind the environment that you work in, the hygiene that you apply when making your recipes. It's important to have a mix of products on the shelf that you are selling to your customers. For example, a shorter shelf life, longer shelf life, medium shelf life. And then also really important is the ingredients and the role that they play inside the recipe. That is also crucial. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today. You touch on some really interesting and valuable points for artisans and chefs to keep in mind when it comes to shelf life.
It's my absolute pleasure, Manette. I can't wait to listen to the rest of the podcast.
Thank you, Manette. Thank you, Kirsten. It's been a blast. I always say sharing is caring. Now, if you want to kick off with some good recipes, short, medium, and long shelf life, there's a huge amount of inspiration and information in our book, which is The Chocolatier's Kitchen. It's available through Amazon and also other online ordering platforms. You can get it in English, French, and Dutch.
Indeed, The Chocolatier's Kitchen is a must-have for any chocolatier or anyone who's looking for great fundamental recipes.
The Chocolatier's Kitchen. After the book, listen to the podcast series about shelf life in confectionery products.
This is it for today's podcast. Don't miss out on the next one where we will host 2 other guest chefs again. We talked about balancing recipes today. Next time, we'll go more in-depth in specific ingredients and the role that these ingredients play in the shelf life of your bonbon fillings. Let's hear each other soon.